Greetings, esteemed subscribers. Welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to put us through on how you can cut a shirt without an overlapping shoulder. That is a shirt that has a normal shoulder line. So first of all, I went on to mark out the normal basic measurement, which started with the shoulder. I'm using shoulder measurement 16 divided by 2. I've marked out my 8. So the next thing I'm doing now is to get my armhole depth. And for you to get your armhole depth, you divide your bust circumference by 6 and add 1.5 to it. So that is basically what I did here. So I've marked that out. The next thing I'm going to do is to subtract my 1 inch for shoulder slope. After that, I measure out the remaining after subtracting the 1 inch. So what is remaining, I divide it into 2. After dividing it into 2, I connect it from that point of division. I connect for the armhole curve. Okay, so this is where we are starting this shirt, the cutting of this shirt, with the back piece first. Unlike when you're cutting with an overlapping shoulder, you start with the front piece. But for non-overlapping shoulder, I started with the back. So you know that our back armhole is not deep, so it's just normal. So you can see there is no deep curve in it. So the next thing I move on to is to cut out our neckline length. So I'm using 3 inches for the length. Then for the depth, you know, it's the back piece, so I'm using 1 inch so that our collar will be able to stand properly. So that is what I did. I've marked out my 1 inch for the neckline depth. So I connect it like so. That is basically what I'm doing here. So the next thing, I connect the neckline. So after that, the next thing I'm going to do is to mark out other basic bodies measurement, which has to do with the chest line area, the waistline, and the hip. We are using our hip because our hip is the largest part of our body, and this shirt I'm cutting is definitely going to reach the hip part, so there is need to consider the hip in this cutting. So I've marked out my waistline, which I used my shoulder to half length measurement. Then I've marked out my my waist to hip. That is what I basically did. Then the next thing I did here is to mark out from shoulder to the chest line or the bust point. So that's what I did here. So you have, these are the things you take in your measurement. So after that, the next thing is to determine the circumference, the bust circumference. My bust circumference is 10 plus 1 inch for seam allowance. I marked it. Then on my waist circumference is 8.5. I added 1 inch, which is 9.5 for seam allowance. Then my hip is 11. Sorry, the hip is 10 plus 1 inch seam allowance, which is 11. All right, so that is, then you now connect the lines together from your armhole curve, connecting to your bust point, to your waist, down to the hip, then to the end of your shirt length. And here I'm using length 28 because I want the shirt to be long enough. So this is 28 length for the shirt. So I'm done this. The next thing I'm going to do is to cut. You can see it's very simple. So the next thing I'm going to do is to cut out. Then with this back, we are going to use it to trace out on the front part. Now this is the front part, and the first thing I went out to do is to mark out 3 inches, which will be serving as my placket, my bottom placket. So I've already marked it out. You can see that first place where you see the chalk line, that's the 3 inches that I'm going to fold in for my bottom placket. So that's the first thing I did. Then placed my back pattern on the front, and I will use it to trace out so that everything is going to be equal. You can see I'm tracing out the shoulder, the armhole, down to the waist side, all the way down to the hip, because it's going to have the same measurement as the back. The only difference is the 3 inches we added in front for our bottom placket. So all this tracing I'm doing is so that both the back and the front piece are equal. Now on this front part, we are going to do some modifications on the armhole. You know that our armhole is deeper, so we're going to do some modifications on it. But basically what I'm doing now is to trace out, so that when I'm cutting, I'm not going to make any mistake, and both our back piece and our front piece will be equal. Okay, I hope you understand, and I hope I'm not being too fast, please. But if you think that at any point you don't understand anything, you can rewind and listen again, or you can play it back again, and definitely you will understand. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to determine our front neckline. We are still using the 3 inches. You know that the 3 inches is covered in the shoulder line already, so we are now going to come down using 3 inches depth for our front neckline. Our front neckline will be 3 inches by 3 inches, while the back was 3 inches by 1 inch. You understand? So now just going to get the neckline curve, and the neckline curve I'm going to extend it to where I marked out for my button placket. You understand now? So that after folding, everything will be even. So now when I mark, if you notice what I did here, I did not like connect it straight. I gave a curve on that space, on that 3 inches space I gave for the button placket. And the reason why I did that is so that when I'm folding the button placket, I won't be short of fabric, so that I'll have excess, so that when I'm done folding, I can cut out the excess. So yeah, this is it basically. So the next thing we are going to do now is the modification I talked about on the armhole. You can see I'm trying to make it more visible. Now on the armhole, you know that our front armhole is deeper than the back, so we are trying to get in that deep curve at the back. So we are going to determine how many inches that armhole is, then we'll get the midpoint. That's what I did now. So I've gotten the midpoint, and on that midpoint I'll enter in by half an inch. All right, so when I enter in by half an inch, what I will now do is connect it to that point, then curve it down again. You can see the curve because of how curvy our front armhole is. You can see it, right? So I'm done. You can see that curve is not the same with the back piece. So this is basically the modification I talked about. So yeah, I'm done. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to cut out everything, cut out the front piece, but I'm going to leave the back piece on it while I'm cutting. The reason is to be sure that there is no extra fabric added to the back, so that we don't have excesses while joining. You understand? So the next thing I'm going to do is to cut out the down parts, making sure that they are the same equivalent, they are equal. All right, so that's what I'm doing now. Just cut carefully, cut, make sure your fabric is not shifting, so that you don't have excess fabric when you are sewing. So I'm done cutting. I had to remove the back piece and now cut, so that I can be able to cut the armhole of the front piece properly. Then this is basically what I'm doing here. So if this is your first time coming across my channel, please do well to give me a thumbs up. You can drop a comment to encourage me, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in my next tutorial. Thank you. Bye.